generic list, generic list item, 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 generic list item.
For my brothers, no lie. All you can die. Never wrong, they right.
Generic list item, generic list item, generic list item.
With the gang, we ball out, it can get tragic. All we got, we gon' let you.
Generic list item.
Stuck in my ways, think I need to change my habits. What would you do if you were me and didn't have? Look in the mirror, now I'm feeling like a savage. Tell my son I love him, for him I'ma make it happen. Now my dreams reality.
Generic list type, generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list item, generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list item, generic list item, generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list item. Generic list, generic list, generic list, generic list item.
What would you do if you were me?
Entering franchise hub screen things, team adjust line, members, league schedule, stent, options, league stent, transactions. Members you have, team adjust, my team, things to do you have 2 options, team my team, my coach, my team, my coach, team you have 6 options, coach, my team you have 6 options, my members you, lead transactions, standings, news. Entering screen filter you have 3 options, my store, all stories 140. Entering franchise stats. Entering awards stats you have 3 options, yearly awards. Entering 2023 annual awards screen, 10 rows 6 columns left, filter and coach of the year selected. MVP selected, AFC selected, DPOY selected, ROI selected, ROI selected, Best QB selected, Best RB selected, Best WR selected, Best L selected, Best GL selected, Best LB selected, Best GB selected, Best K selected, Opoy selected, NFC selected, DPOY selected, Opoy selected, DPOY selected, ROI selected,
Great colored coupes. Oh no, I can't be number 2. MVP to lead most
Boy selected.
Talking trophies, I didn't grab if you can't match this attitude.
Best QB selected.
Please, I move like the wind, can't catch this breeze.
Best RB selected.
Tracks, there's not no preseason.
Best WR selected. Best L selected.
Forfeit your team shouldn't even show up. What you wanna be when you grow up? They used to ask me. Naturally, I chose.
Best GL selected.
Never match me. We ain't go together. Like camouflage.
Best LB selected.
Focus on your position.
Best QB selected.
It's a long season.
Best K selected.
For the wrong reasons, trying to get my number.
Opoy selected.
Frauds beat us. I figured out the
DPOY selected. ROI selected. ROI selected. Best QB selected. Entering 2023 annual awards screen. Award. Entering franchise hub screen.